My name is Riley Morgan. I am 34 years old and work as a market analyst for a mid-sized technology firm in Chicago. That title sounds stable, maybe even impressive, but titles have a way of hiding the truth. On that particular Tuesday, the truth was sitting in a crowded company cafeteria when my direct manager, Ethan Carter, leaned back in his chair, smirked, and asked loudly enough for 3 tables to hear how it felt to be replaceable. The sound of utensils against trays faded into a strange quiet. I could feel eyes darting between us before quickly dropping to half-finished lunches. My fork hung in the air, the bite of pasta cooling as my stomach tightened. Ethan watched me like a man enjoying a private joke he wanted everyone else to witness. I forced myself to set my fork down gently. The heat rising up my neck was impossible to hide, but I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. The corners of his smile lifted just slightly, more like he was feeding off the silence. Around the table, shoulders hunched and conversations turned into awkward murmurs about the weather or weekend plans. Faye tapped her foot under the table against mine, a silent reminder I wasn't alone. But in that moment, it felt like I was standing on a stage with every light pointed at me. I replied as evenly as I could, asking him what an interesting question like that meant. But he only glanced at his watch, the expensive one he liked to mention during budget meetings, and said he was just thinking about the future. That single exchange was the latest chapter in a long and exhausting story between us. I had been at this company for 18 months, and for all 18, Ethan had made it clear he believed my place here was temporary, maybe even undeserved. It started subtly, with him taking credit for small ideas during team updates. Over time, it grew bolder. The full strategies I developed were presented to upper management as my own work. Projects I had built from scratch were suddenly labeled as successes of his department. He was a master at performing leadership for those above him while draining the recognition from those below. I knew he wanted me gone, and not just gone, but diminished. That cafeteria moment wasn't random. It was another move in his quiet campaign to erase my value. The thing is, you can't survive in a place like this without learning to read the room. I knew who would look away, who would smirk along with him, and who might offer a quick word of support later when no one was watching. I also knew Ethan's reputation wasn't built on hard work or creative thinking, but on positioning himself between other people's talent and the people with power. That knowledge burned in me as I dabbed the corner of my mouth with my napkin, nodded like his question meant nothing, and went back to my lunch. Inside, though, I was already replaying every moment that had led to this one, every time I had swallowed the urge to speak up and wondering how much longer I could afford to stay silent. When I first joined the company, I was excited in a way I hadn't been in years. The interview process had been competitive, and I felt proud to have landed the role. Ethan greeted me on my first day with a warm handshake, an easy smile, and promises about the kind of opportunities that could shape a career. He spoke about how much he valued fresh perspectives and how he saw real potential in my background. I believed him. For the first week, he introduced me around, gave me space to learn, and seemed genuinely invested in my success. That illusion didn't last long. 2 weeks in, I watched him stand in front of the executive team and present a comprehensive market expansion strategy. Every slide was mine. I had spent late nights pulling industry data, mapping competitor moves, and identifying new opportunities in emerging markets. He didn't just borrow my ideas. He read my analysis almost word for word as if it had always been his. I sat in the back of the room, hands folded, heart pounding, waiting for him to acknowledge my work. He never did. The executives nodded impressed and congratulated him afterward. When I asked about it later, he brushed me off and said ideas move upward and credit stays with leadership. It was said casually, like he was explaining the weather. After that, the pattern repeated so often, it became routine. A client engagement plan I spent weeks refining appeared in a quarterly review presentation as an initiative developed under Ethan's guidance. Faye's customer retention strategy was rebranded as an example of his leadership in action. Alex's coding solutions for a major client crisis were framed as results of teamwork fostered by management. The more successful our work was, the more he used it to build his image. If we failed, the failure was ours alone. It was a one-way street where recognition flowed up and blame flowed down. I started to notice how the entire company operated on this unspoken system. Those in higher positions hoarded credit like a form of currency. It wasn't just Ethan. Other managers did it too, using other people's output to secure promotions, bonuses, and influence. Success was measured by visibility, not contribution. If you were in the right meetings with the right people, you could rise without ever creating anything yourself. If you weren't, your work could be invisible no matter how impactful it was. The most frustrating part was knowing I couldn't just walk away. I had student loans rent that seemed to climb every year, and a job market where stability felt like a luxury. The fear of unemployment weighed heavier than the resentment I carried every day. So I kept showing up. I kept producing work I knew might be stolen, hoping that somewhere along the way, the right person would see through the act. Still, each time it happened, it chipped away at my trust, my confidence, and my patience. I learned to swallow the anger, to fake a nod of agreement in meetings when Ethan spun my projects into his victories. I told myself I was playing the long game, that leaving on my own terms would be better than storming out in defeat, but the truth was simpler. I needed the paycheck, and he knew it. That gave him the power to keep taking without consequence. It was a power he wielded with ease, almost like it was second nature. And deep down I realized it probably was. It was close to 9 on a Thursday night, when I decided to take a break from the spreadsheet I had been staring at for hours. Most of the office was dark and silent, the hum of the vending machine, the only sound as I walked toward the break room. I expected to find it empty, but instead, Ava Thompson, our CEO, was standing by the counter sipping tea and looking over a stack of printed reports. I froze for a second. I had only spoken to her briefly in group settings, and those encounters were always formal. Seeing her alone felt like stumbling into a scene I wasn't meant to interrupt. She glanced up and nodded toward the coffee machine, giving me an easy smile that made it less awkward. I poured myself a cup, telling myself to just say hello and get out. But my eyes drifted to the reports in her hand, and I recognized them immediately. They were quarterly sales projections, the kind that only told half the story. Before I could stop myself, I said we were measuring the wrong things. She raised an eyebrow, curious rather than annoyed, and asked me to explain. My heart pounded as I pulled a napkin from the dispenser and sketched 3 simple metrics I believed could better predict long-term performance. She leaned in, asking questions that cut straight to the core of the problems I had been thinking about for months. We talked about how the current data ignored customer lifetime value, how market shifts weren't reflected in our forecasting, and how measuring only short-term wins created blind spots that hurt innovation. Her questions weren't small talk. She wanted to know why no one had brought this up before, and I gave her the most careful answer I could without throwing anyone under the bus. She studied me for a moment, then asked if I could create a full, detailed analysis for her eyes only. I agreed before my brain had caught up with my mouth. Over the next several weeks, I lived a double life at work. By day, I completed Ethan's assignments, hitting every deadline pretending nothing had changed. By night, I gathered data from every department I could get access to. I spent my lunch breaks interviewing long-term clients about what made them stay or leave. I pored over market research industry reports and competitor case studies until my eyes burned. I kept the documents on a personal drive, encrypted and labeled in a way no one in my department would notice. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every time Ethan walked past my desk, I wondered if he could sense my focus shifting. He had a way of noticing the smallest changes in people's behavior. I became hyper-aware of my screen when he was around closing tabs or switching to whatever project he had assigned me that week. At the same time, I felt a growing sense of purpose I hadn't felt since joining the company. For once, my work wasn't being filtered through someone else's ego before reaching the top. The deeper I went, the more I uncovered patterns that explained why our growth had stalled, despite strong sales numbers. Decision-making was slow because it passed through too many layers of approval. High-performing employees were leaving because their contributions weren't recognized. Short-term revenue goals often clashed with long-term sustainability. I began drafting recommendations that were as bold as they were risky, knowing that if this analysis saw the light of day, it could challenge the very structure of the company. I kept reminding myself this was a gamble. Ava might read it and decide it wasn't worth pursuing. She might share it with Ethan, which would end my time here faster than I could pack a box. But every night, as I pieced together data points and stories from across the organization, I felt the flicker of something I thought I had lost. Hope. Not just for my own career, but for the possibility that this place could be better than what it had become. The morning after that cafeteria moment, Ava's assistant sent me a brief calendar invite. Conference room B, 10 a.m., with no agenda listed. When I walked in, Ethan was already there, leaning back in his chair with the same smug look he had worn over lunch. He greeted me with a nod that felt more like a warning. Ava entered moments later carrying a folder that she set in front of her as she took the seat at the head of the table. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She said she had received an extraordinary analysis that exposed critical flaws in the way our company operated. She opened the folder and began listing the 3 biggest failures outlined in my report. First, decision-making processes were unnecessarily complex, creating bottlenecks that slowed projects to a crawl. Second, the company's compensation structure failed to reward actual contributions, leading to low morale and high turnover among top performers. Third, and most pointedly, she addressed the pattern of misattributing credit, which not only violated ethics, but also discouraged innovation. As she spoke, her eyes moved between Ethan and me, the meaning in her gaze impossible to miss. I sat still, my pulse racing, keeping my face neutral. Ethan adjusted his posture, crossing his arms as if bracing for impact. Ava then outlined her decision. Effective immediately, the layer of middle management between specialists and executives would be eliminated. Project leads would be chosen based on expertise, not title. She turned directly to Ethan and told him he could either transition into a specialist role where performance would be transparently measured or accept a severance package. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since I'd known him, the confidence in his expression faltered. I didn't move or speak, but inside I felt a current of satisfaction ripple through me. It wasn't a triumph in the way I once imagined it, but it was the first real shift in power I had ever seen here. Ava finished by announcing that I would be leading a newly formed innovation division, reporting directly to her. She described the division's mission in broad strokes, making it clear it was meant to set the tone for the company's future. I could feel Ethan's stare heavy with disbelief, but I kept my eyes on Ava, nodding once in acknowledgement. The meeting ended quickly after that. As we left the room, I caught a glimpse of Ethan's reflection in the glass wall, his expression sharp and unreadable. I knew this wasn't over. But for the first time in 18 months, it felt like I had a fighting chance. Ethan left the company within 2 weeks of that meeting, taking the severance and disappearing from my daily life. For a while, I allowed myself to believe he was part of my past. That illusion shattered when I read the press release announcing him as the new Chief Strategy Officer for our largest competitor. The timing was almost cinematic. Just as I was preparing to lead our first major international bid, I learned he would be leading the opposing proposal. It wasn't just business anymore. It was a test of everything I had fought to build. The client was a multinational firm seeking a partner for a multi-year expansion into new markets. We knew the project would define our reputation for years. My team agreed we would present exactly as we worked openly, collaboratively with the specialists who would be on the ground doing the work front and center. Each segment of the proposal was handled by the person who owned it. Faye covered client engagement strategies. Alex spoke about the technical infrastructure, and our compliance lead addressed the regulatory complexities. We didn't hide challenges. Instead, we explained how we would manage them. The room felt engaged, asking questions directly to the people responsible, rather than filtering them through me. Ethan's team went first that morning. His presentation was sleek, polished, and calculated to impress at a glance. He positioned himself as the singular voice of authority speaking for every department. I recognized pieces of methodology from my earlier work wrapped in the same controlling narrative he had always used. When our turn came, I could sense the contrast immediately. Where his approach kept the focus on himself, ours put the spotlight on the people who would deliver results. Days later, the decision came through. We had won the contract. The client said our transparency and direct engagement with specialists gave them confidence that no glossy presentation could match. It was more than a victory. It was proof that our way worked. Ava called the company-wide meeting on a Monday morning, the kind that drew everyone from department heads to junior staff into the main conference hall. She stood at the front, confident and deliberate, and announced a new initiative, a side-by-side public comparison of two operational models. One would be the collaborative approach my team had been developing. The other would be the traditional top-down structure still favored by some competitors. She emphasized that the results would be shared openly, from productivity metrics to employee retention and client satisfaction. Then she dropped the final detail. Both companies would participate, and their strategies would be led by me and Ethan. For a second, I thought I had imagined the tightening of his jaw across the room. He sat near the aisle perfectly still, but his eyes locked on Ava like he was weighing how much of this was personal. The announcement had been framed as an industry learning opportunity, a neutral experiment in innovation, but we both knew the stakes went beyond that. She had just set the stage for a direct and measurable comparison of our leadership styles. He cleared his throat before answering that his company was willing to participate, his voice carefully steady. I recognized it for what it was, a reluctant concession under pressure. After the meeting, whispers spread fast. People speculated about whether Ethan would try to undermine the process or twist the metrics to his advantage. I knew him well enough to expect he'd do both if he could, but this time, the rules were Ava's. The data would be gathered by a neutral third party, and every result would be posted publicly. There would be no private meetings to spin the story before it went live. As I walked out of the room, I caught a glimpse of him speaking with his COO, his gestures sharp and controlled. This wasn't just business for him anymore. It was a battle he hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from, and I was already planning how to make sure my side won. The results were released on a Friday morning, a moment timed to ensure the entire industry would be watching before the weekend. The numbers spoke louder than any pitch or meeting could. Our collaborative model delivered higher productivity across every project. Creative output was up by nearly a third compared to the baseline, and client satisfaction ratings broke company records. Employee surveys showed engagement levels that rivaled some of the most desirable workplaces in the country. On the other side, Ethan's team met basic targets, but showed steep drops in retention and morale. The contrast was sharp enough to sting. I watched the live stream of the announcement from our conference room, and my team gathered around me. The third-party auditor read the findings without drama, but the meaning in the numbers was impossible to miss. The camera cut briefly to Ethan, sitting stiffly at a table with his executives. His expression was controlled, but the slight tightening around his mouth betrayed the hit. Then the final blow came. The host announced that in response to the results, his company's board had decided to restructure, adopting a collaborative framework and removing the current head of strategy. The words hung in the air for a beat, and just like that, Ethan was out. News traveled fast. By the end of the day, industry blogs and business columns were dissecting the experiment. Commentators called it a turning point, a signal that the old model was losing ground. Inside our office, there was a quiet sense of vindication, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever seen their work go unnoticed. I didn't celebrate with loud cheers or public gloating. Instead, I took a moment to look around the room at my team, the people who had built this win alongside me. Justice had been served, and it was sweeter for being earned the right way. 6 months after the public comparison, I had settled into a rhythm I never thought possible. The consortium I had founded to promote collaborative business models was gaining momentum, attracting companies that wanted to modernize without losing their soul. We hosted workshops, shared best practices, and connected leaders across industries. It felt like building something bigger than my own career. Then one afternoon, my assistant forwarded me an email with a name I hadn't seen in a while. Ethan wanted to meet. Part of me expected it to be a demand or a thinly veiled attempt at reclaiming some ground. Instead, his message was short and direct. He wanted to join the consortium. He said he had been watching our progress and believed there was a place for him to contribute. I read it twice, weighing the sincerity behind the words. When we met a week later, he looked different. The sharp edges in his demeanor had softened, replaced by something that might have been humility. Still, I wasn't about to let history repeat itself. I told him I was open to the idea, but there would be conditions. A 3-month trial period working directly under my oversight. Every step of his involvement would be transparent, documented, and shared with the rest of the consortium. If he wanted in, he would have to prove he could work without hoarding credit or undermining others. He agreed without hesitation. I watched him closely during those first weeks. He asked more questions than he made statements. He deferred to subject matter experts in meetings. There were moments when the old instinct to dominate flickered in his eyes, but he caught himself. Halfway through the trial, we co-hosted a seminar for mid-sized tech firms. I saw him listening, really listening to a junior project manager explain how her team had solved a problem by pooling ideas in an open forum. When she finished, he thanked her and gave her the floor again to answer questions. It was a small thing, but for him, it felt monumental. I realized then that the change might be real. By the end of the 3 months, he asked for a private meeting. We sat across from each other in the same building where I had first presented my ideas to Ava. He told me plainly that he had been wrong. The collaborative model worked better than he ever believed it could, and not just for the numbers. It made people want to show up to give their best because they knew it mattered. He said he wanted to keep building that kind of environment, even if it meant his name wasn't at the top of every success. For the first time in years, I believed him. I welcomed him into the consortium as a full member. We shook hands, not as rivals, but as people who had learned from the worst parts of themselves. As I walked out of that room, I thought about how I had once dreamed of defeating him, of watching him lose everything. Now the victory felt different. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making someone lose, it's about changing the very definition of winning.